Hey everyone, I'm here with Jack Dozier. He is a co-founder of the Yale Youth Poll, which works with Verasight for survey data collection. And the Yale Youth Poll just had their spring 2026 results come out. So we're going to talk with Jack. I'm going to talk with Jack about the Yale Youth Poll, why it matters, and dig into some of the most interesting top lines for the 2026 results. So Jack, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Yale Youth Poll?
Yeah, Tyler, well, thank you so much. Verasight has been such an incredible partner on this project over the past year. And I'm very excited to be talking about the Youth Poll. This is our fourth iteration of the Youth Poll. It's a biannual poll based on academic semesters. So we have one every fall and every spring. We are a public opinion research project based at the Institution for Social and Policy Studies here at Yale University. And we are entirely run by undergraduates. So while we work with Verasight to recruit our national sample in our question preparation process, of course, we're very grateful to some faculty advisors and faculty sponsors. At the end of the day, it is a poll entirely run by undergraduates, trying to understand both our peers and people of our age group.
Amazing. That's super cool. So maybe you can talk a little bit more, Jack, about why you originally decided to start the Yale Youth Poll.
Yeah.
I know you're a political science student at Yale. So what made you think it was so important to start getting data specifically on the group that you're targeting with the poll?
Yeah, that is a great question. So our first poll originated back in around, I think it was middle of October in 2024. We were certainly under a crazy amount of pressure to release before the election, given that a lot of our poll was focusing, in fact, on the very notable 2024 presidential race. But what we saw is a gap in the research of young Americans and of people of our age, where with so many surveys, a lot of times the youth samples would often have preferences that didn't necessarily align with data from the polls. So I might say that young voters are voting for candidate X at 60%, but in reality, it only ends up being 51 or 52%. We've seen that happen a number of times, especially since 2016, as many polling methods have changed. So we were particularly interested in looking into this age cohort. Back then, we studied from 18 to 29, but now we're focusing more on ages 18 to 34 as our quote unquote young voter demographic. And one thing that we do that is unique to our youth focused poll is, yes, we do have an oversample of young voters, but at the same time, we also provide a sample of voters above 35. So what we do is we ensure that we have this comparison point. So all of the observations that we're making are really grounded in this evidence. And we're really lucky to be able to do this with a firm such as Verasight, because we're getting really high quality data from the beginning, even before stratification and before weighting. We're getting very high quality data on these issues, where it's a unique opportunity to be able to explore what are on young voters' minds, especially as a member of Generation Z and studying members of my own generation. Very unique opportunity, especially with voting tendencies and preferences. So we're very lucky to be able to undertake a project like this. And over the past four polls, we've really looked at a myriad of issues where we're not just looking at a horse race. We're also looking at what are young voter sentiments on AI and technology. And most recently, we did AI, technology, democracy, and overreach, as well as study on patterns of anti-Semitism. So we really are excited to be able to test these contemporary topics while both offering our findings to government, academic, and journalistic stakeholders, where we're very excited to see our most recent poll was cited everywhere from the New York Times and Washington Post to, if I'm not mistaken, over 8,000 posts on Twitter or in the federal executive, where there was a comment made by the White House Communications Office basically saying, well, we're not too worried how young voters are swinging this way or that way, which was certainly a really unique opportunity for a group of undergraduates to be able to say, well, the White House wasn't too happy with the polling results. But that's also the special part, is that we're working on finding this nonpartisan data as an opportunity to figure out really what is on the minds of our peers and of American voters writ large, working with the registered voters and likely voters of Verasight sample to actually figure out on a nonpartisan basis, what do Americans think right now? And that's been such an incredible opportunity.
Love it. That's amazing. The Yale Youth Poll reaches everywhere, even to the White House. Super cool. Yeah, it's always from Verasight's seat. I obviously see a lot of news reactions to polling and survey data, and people's reactions are often just depend on whether they like what the survey results were or not.
Yeah, I mean, a way to tell that you have a truly academic and nonpartisan research project is to get both praise and criticism from every corner of the political spectrum. And let me tell you, we definitely got that on some of these results, where it was great to see that it wasn't just one party embraces this result or the other disavows it. Like, no, we had people who, within our horse race questions, within our ideology questions, found things to praise and things to issue, or things to criticize on both sides. And we're very happy to get that feedback and criticism, because we know it's what makes our research stronger going forward.
Very cool. Very cool. So with that said, in your spring 2026 results, which recently came out, what do you think are some of the most interesting returns that you found from the questions that you asked?
Yeah, there's some things that are maybe more expected, where we, of course, run a horse race question, as most every public opinion poll will do. Vice President J.D. Vance does lead the 2028 GOP primary in our findings. Whereas an interesting thing is thinking about the contemporary differences between the Democratic and Republican parties. The plans to vote for younger voters in the Democratic primary are pretty largely different than those of their parents' generation, where we're seeing a primary landscape where younger Democrats are continuing to prefer former Vice President Harris and Representative Ocasio-Cortez, whereas we see some older Democrats, those being above 35 plus, prefer Governor Newsom or former Secretary Buttigieg, where it's been really an interesting opportunity to see these two bases. And we did do something that has kind of tended to be conventional, but is a very hot topic in the polling world right now, which is polling for a Trump third term, where we are not in any way endorsing, or one way or another, any candidacy. And many times people will question, well, even though it's constitutional, why do you still poll on that issue? Our answer is, we want to see how people are feeling on this possibility. And within the scope of the study, President Trump does have a fairly notable lead still, when included, on these horse race issues within the Republican primary voting universe, which goes to show, obviously, there could be a number of covariant issues that could just be related to approval or related to a general remembrance of people's voting in 2024. But it is really important to still ask questions like that. And of course, we do write a disclaimer saying, again, we are nonpartisan. We're not endorsing in one way or another. We are solely doing this in the interest of public opinion research. But that's a really fascinating finding that happens kind of every time around.
No matter how President Trump appears on the ballot, no, even if it's not constitutional, he still has strong support in the sort of Republican voter primary base. Interesting. And that's...
sorry.
Oh, no, you go ahead, Jack.
Yeah. Overall, if he were on the GOP ballot, we're seeing almost a 30-point lead above Vance and almost a 40-point lead above Rubio. So it's an interesting balance that, while it's kind of decisive when you remove that question and you find pretty overwhelmingly voters are choosing Vice President Vance, it then goes back to a poll that you may have seen a few years ago. So I think that is certainly an interesting question that really is continuously debated within this world of polling and public opinion research.
And that the answer to that question of primary favorability, including President Trump, is that something you see a significant difference on between the youth sample that you're targeting and the alternative sample that you're comparing against for older voters?
That is a really good question. It is in part a difference that we see where young voters are, I think it was about 30%, whereas voters who were 45 plus were around 52%. So there is that difference, but still, I would say fairly decisively, should there be a potential third term for President Trump, or at least a third, or I should say fourth candidacy, there's still the largest basis of support in his camp.
Fascinating. So you've been running this poll, you mentioned, since the fall of 2024. So since immediately prior to the 2024 presidential election up till now. Are there any major changes you've seen or observed amongst the youth sample in their attitudes over that time?
Absolutely. One of the most decisive ones is the difference of younger voters, especially those who are college-aged, in their political tendencies. So back in spring 2025, we found pretty notable evidence that said young voters, especially young men in this college demographic, were overwhelmingly supportive of Republicans, where it was a kind of shocking result, especially given that people tend to think of college-aged voters as being fairly progressive and fairly liberal. We've seen a shift in that, where over the past year, we've seen that Trump's approval rating as well as the voting plan has changed for young voters specifically. It's not necessarily the most prolific swing, but still with this basis of younger voters, we have seen Democrats are now leading this generic ballot, which we had this almost opposite result back in the spring of 2025. And of course, many headlines and different events have happened in between those two dates. But it's been a really impressive and interesting finding that I at least would say I found unexpected, but really a fascinating insight into my demographics voting tendency.
Is there anything you found in the underlying kind of questions or surrounding questions that suggested why that would be, or like motivation for the youth demographic shifting more towards the Democratic Party?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. Right now, I think quite literally the DNC and RNC are spending millions of dollars to answer that question. There are a number of potential explanations for it where it's not necessarily our duty to make those conclusions, but
sure.
I would say the maybe more decisive issues, especially thinking about when this survey was fielded versus when the previous survey was fielded, is thinking about the difference in the geopolitical climate, where young men historically had a higher tendency to get drafted, but also are at the beginning of their careers or in college and maybe concerned about the most kitchen table issues like paying for gas, paying for electricity. And when thinking about the recent conflict in Iran and in the Middle East, especially with younger people, the impact is seen more or less the highest, because if you are in college or if you are in the very beginning of your career and you need to drive to work, you'll notice when the gas prices go from $3.20 to $4. That's a really notable difference. And that's especially something that was occurring when we fielded our poll. And I think there's probably an elasticity to it, but at the same time, I would presume that these young voters probably are going to stick a little bit with this shift, just because in the fall 25 the fall 2025 generic ballot, we saw that Democrats were leading with young men by 3 points. And now in the spring, it's by 2 points instead of by 3, but that's kind of within a margin of error that still shows this growing support with these college-aged men. And it is quite a difference from the spring of 2025.
Fascinating. Is there anything else from the spring results that you think people should know about? Anything particularly surprising or that you think is really important for people to understand or maybe is misunderstood relative to your results about the youth? Yeah,
that's a great thing to ask. One of the more notable parts of that is that maybe not necessarily a surprise to people in college, but younger voters are more prone to use AI than older voters. But kind of a question on potential reforms that we asked that I was particularly excited to see the results for was we, based off of a New York Times study, fielded a question where half of the images were traditional stock photos, I think pulled from, if I'm not mistaken, Adobe or some platform like that. And then there were 2 images. These were all headshots. The other 2 images were created by Gemini. And what we had hoped to find there was we'd see how confident people, especially young people, felt about being able to determine an AI image or video or audio, and then put it to the test, where these questions are 2 that are very important, especially in an era of political ads that have AI depictions of elected officials, where I saw one recently. My home state is Virginia, and tomorrow, April 21st, is the special election, the referendum for the constitutional amendment on redistricting. And there was a Republican-backed ad that had a video of our governor, Abigail Spanberger. I think it was lighting a depiction of the Commonwealth on fire, where obviously it was AI generated and it was created to make her appear in a certain manner or another. And when there's that opportunity with fairly realistic videos to make elected officials, to make these decision makers appear to be doing one potentially salacious thing or another, it becomes really important to understand how the accuracy is of younger voters, but also voters at large, at being able to identify that. The most concerning result, at least for me as a political science student, but also just as a American voter, is that the ability of all voters to determine which images were AI and which were of actual humans came out to about a coin toss on accuracy, where there was no decisive finding, which would be hopeful for our democracy that 75% of people chose the correct image. No, it came out to coin toss accuracy at whether or not people were able to identify, is this a headshot of a young man AI or an actual human? And that's especially concerning when voters are saying pretty decisively, I am certainly able to determine whether this image is of a human or AI. And I think that is one of the findings that is most revealing of this study.
So it sounds like there is a mismatch between people's evaluation of their ability, self-evaluation of their ability to identify AI images and what the results showed when you actually asked them to do so.
Yep, precisely.
I think we all like to think that we could we could do it, but I bet if you put me to the test right now, I don't know if I'd do much better than a coin flip.
Yeah, we intentionally chose ones that not necessarily were inordinately difficult, but we were obviously going to filter out ones where maybe they had 4 eyes or something like that. We genuinely had one where the image that was generated had 2 eyes here, but then also one here and one here. And we went, okay, that there might be some indicators there that that's not your everyday depiction of a headshot, but we worked on it and we found these images that could be a little challenging, but at the end of the day, coin toss accuracy is concerning, especially when it only takes a few seconds to generate these images or videos.
And it was even challenging, or it was even coin toss accuracy amongst the youth sample, who I think I know I would have assumed that people who kind of grew up natively in the AI world, use AI all the time, would be better at discerning between an AI image and a real one. Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, Jack, it's been great spending some time with you. Maybe I'll just ask a closing question that you can take anywhere you want. With these results from spring 2026 and with the Yale Youth Poll in general, what should people be looking out for next? What should they do with these results, and what should they be looking out for going forward from the Yale Youth Poll?
Yeah, one thing that I'm certainly following closely is the issue of political or AI use of political figures. Governor Hochul in the state of New York has been working on legislation essentially requiring permission to use the likeliness of a political official in this election-based advertising for their AI likeliness. I think that's something that should be watched closely, especially when there is still growing legislation on AI use pretty generally in the or on the federal level right now. So I think that's one of the things that I'm watching closely currently. And within these results, I think we are looking towards a pretty big midterm cycle in November of this year. So I think seeing these issues that we asked on a big tent party versus a more constricted party, seeing how those play out in real time on these congressional agendas, but also on voters' reception to these congressional agendas will be the most fascinating thing to me, which I, for one, am very excited to see.
Amazing. Well, we're excited to follow along with everything you guys are doing. And thanks so much for spending time with me today, Jack.
Of course. Thank you so much, Tyler.
Cheers.